Hello everyone, I'm Kevin Fandel, and today we're going to talk about contracts. Let's get started. In this presentation, we are going to focus our attention on one of the most important elements in forming a valid contract in the United States, and that is the element of consideration. Consideration has been defined as the exchange element in a contract. Now, what that means, practically speaking, is that both parties must be benefiting in some way from the exchange. If they're not, and only one party is benefiting, we might say that's a gift or a donation. Gifts and donations are not part of contract law, and they do not benefit from the rules of contracts. However, it's not as easy as it may sound to find consideration in a contract. Consideration may be defined as money, it may be defined as property, or it may be defined as something a little bit less physical. Let's start out our discussion of consideration by looking at one of the key cases that helps us define the meaning of consideration, Hamer v. Sidway. Imagine for a moment that you're living in the late 19th century in a relatively poor family in a poor area. You've worked very hard, starting your own businesses, becoming quite an entrepreneur, and making a good living for yourself, such that you are the one in the family that everyone looks to provide for them. One day, when you're with many of your family members, you observe them smoking, drinking, gambling, and doing things that you might consider to be a little bit disgraceful. You select one of your favorite nephews, and you decide to use him as your legacy, since you don't have any children of your own. You invite this nephew over, who's 15 years old at the time, and you tell him that if he promises to give up drinking, smoking, swearing, and gambling until he turns 21, you will give him $5,000 on his 21st birthday. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why would I give up all of those things that I enjoy doing for 6 years for a measly $5,000? Thanks to inflation, $5,000 in 1891 is worth quite a bit more in 2017. So, obviously, nephew agrees. He gives up drinking, smoking, swearing, and gambling for 6 years as promised, at least as far as we know. On his 21st birthday, he writes a letter to his uncle, telling him that he has complied with his promises and now he would like the $5,000. The uncle sends a letter back to his nephew, saying, I agree that you've complied with the promises made, and I do owe you the $5,000. However, I don't feel that you're quite ready for it yet, so I'm going to hold it in a special account for you, and when I feel that you are mature enough, I will give it to you. And by the way, I'm sick and I don't know how long I'll be around. The nephew received the letter and apparently didn't complain too much about it. Some time went by and the uncle died. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because the uncle died and left behind plenty of money, he had what we call an estate, and he needed somebody to manage that estate. That person was Franklin Sidway. Mr. Sidway's job was to be the executor on the estate of the dead uncle. And that means that he got to decide where the money went. There's of course a will, so money would go to certain individuals, but there was extra money in there that had to be paid to creditors. The question in this case is, was the nephew actually a creditor? Did he have a valid contract with his uncle? Or was the uncle simply making an offer of a gift? And that is a question of consideration. Now is a good time to point out the difference between a gift and a contract. A gift has 3 elements. You must intend to make a gift, you must deliver that gift, and that gift must be accepted by the recipient. Those are the only three requirements, but if one of them is not met, the gift is incomplete. A contract, as you know, has four requirements. You must intend to be bound by your offer. You must make that valid offer. That offer must be accepted, and there must be some value exchanged. In other words, consideration. If you have a valid contract that has not yet been fully completed when you die, your administrator or executor will pay the creditor. In other words, they will comply with the terms of your contract. Contracts live on after you die. However, if you had intended to make a gift to somebody and you died before the gift was given, the gift dies with you. An executor is not responsible to give that gift to your intended recipient. This creates the problem that we have in Hamer v. Sidway. If Uncle died having intended to give a gift to his nephew of $5,000, then that gift dies with the uncle and nephew doesn't get a penny. However, if we can say that what the uncle did was enter a valid contract with the nephew, then the executor, Mr. Sidway, has to comply with the terms of the contract and give the $5,000 to nephew. What do you think the court should say? Was the nephew's promise to give up drinking, smoking, swearing, and gambling sufficient consideration for the uncle's promise to give $5,000? The court thought so. In fact, the court said the value of the exchange is not necessarily to be measured in monetary terms. The nature of the consideration depends on what's valuable to the parties. In this case, it was valuable to Uncle to have a nephew who was not engaging in what he considered to be despicable behaviors. And that was worth $5,000 to him. So even though we might say all the things that the nephew did were good for him, he gave up the right to do those things in exchange for what the uncle had promised to him. The court set the rule that that would be sufficient consideration. In other words, nephew got his money. We need to say a few more things about consideration before we fully understand it. First of all, consideration must be sufficient. Now that doesn't mean that you have to have a particular value for anything that you're exchanging. There's no price that the courts are looking for, and they generally won't ask about the value versus the price in an exchange. But that doesn't mean that we don't need to have sufficient consideration. And sufficient here means legal sufficiency. There should be some value exchanged, and a legal value is more than just a token. It's an actual value that the parties put on what it is that they are exchanging. That would make your consideration sufficient. In addition, consideration must be present or future, not past. What that means is that you cannot use something that has already been exchanged or given to you as consideration for something you're going to give now or in the future. Your consideration must be present or future only. For instance, if somebody did a favor for you yesterday, that cannot serve as consideration for you to do a favor for them today. And lastly, the consideration must be real and not illusory. This means that the consideration has to be something that we would consider creating a risk on the party if the other party accepts an offer. If you maintain unlimited options to walk away from your offer even after it would be accepted, you have made an illusory promise, an illusion of a promise. Since you have not committed in any way to be bound by your promise, your consideration is insufficient. This usually happens when a party, an offeror, includes a number of conditions within their offer that allow them to exit a potential contract without liability. The second point on the screen says that adequacy is irrelevant. The adequacy refers to the amount being exchanged, and as I said before, we do need legally sufficient consideration, but the courts don't look into the actual amount being exchanged, unless one of the parties argues that it was an unconscionable contract. Unconscionable would mean that one of the parties was taken advantage of. For instance, somebody tricked them into giving up something of significant value for very little money or very little consideration. Generally speaking, though, those cases are rare. Finally, consideration does not exist if the party has a pre-existing duty to perform. This means that you can't add to a contract that already exists additional consideration. If you've already obligated yourself to do something, you can't ask the other party to provide you with more consideration to do the same thing that you already promised. Once you've made your deal, you have to stick with it. Thank you for your attention and for your interest in studying contracts with me.